Yeah. Hello. Runner. Some of you may know me. If you don't, I'm a Mage Theory crafting contributor. I'm an expert in the Mage Discord. I wrote guides for Alter Time. I now maintain the Mage Compendium guides. I'm a dev and maintainer of the Mage Sims website, and contrary to a lot of people in my position, I do actually play the game. I'm a raider and an officer in Mist on Taramil EU. So some people wanted me to make a video about my thoughts on 9.1. I've made a few documents and I've thrown a lot of things in the Mage Discord, but I thought it'd be nice to make a video just to like collect everything in one place. So I'm going to start with going over what changed in 9.1, spec changes, covenant changes, soulbind changes, and then I'm going to talk about what makes each of the three specs good in like an abstract, not within the context of the next raid. And then I'm going to talk about what I think is actually going to be good in the next raid. So first thing to start off with, fire nerfs. So these are like really big. To start off, like 1 minute combustion is kind of arbitrary. We didn't have exactly 60 seconds in Castle Nathria, and like it doesn't matter if it gets stacked like 60 seconds or not. Like more cooldown reduction is just better. Like fire isn't trying to line combustion up with other things. Like demo wants Tyrant down to 1 minute, so it can line it up with Grimoire Felguard, things like that. We don't have that. So fights where this is the biggest nerf are and basically like anything you combust on cooldown. So like if Sludge Fist was to happen again, you wouldn't be able to combust every pillar phase. Single target fights like Hungering or Guardian, the first ones where you just jam combustion on cooldown and you just want to do as much damage as possible, you probably like lose a combustion cast in those encounters. Considering that fire single target's not that good anyway, like this is a huge nerf. So there are some situations where this doesn't matter. So Kindling still makes combustion one of like the shortest cooldowns in the game. It probably has like the best strength to cooldown ratio of like any cooldown. So this is still useful in progress. It lets you use cooldowns in places you wouldn't be able to. So Gloomvale and Sardonathrius is a really good example. It happens that like if you're doing the Echo strat, you do that at like 340-ish. And like 2 minute classes are holding their 2 minute cooldowns for like almost 2 minutes. They use like an entire use just to use cooldowns there, whereas like mages almost make no concessions at all. So there is still a place for that on Mythic Progress, but I don't really think it'll come out in Sanctum, as I'll talk about later. So the Infernal Cascade nerf is not that big, but it's not a big nerf to your overall damage, but it's a really big nerf to your like useful damage. Like if you're like combust this thing, then like you're worse at that now. The Kindling nerf's like way bigger than the Infernal Cascade nerf. But it does end up being bad in fights like Sludge Fist, Sire, SLG, where you're like damage here now. The Flame Strike, Flame Patch nerfs don't really do anything in raids. They're pretty big in Mythic Plus. I think it probably knocks fire off the top spot in Mythic Plus, but fire was like so far ahead of everything that I think it's probably still fine. So the nerfs work out at roughly 10% on single target and 15% in AoE, though it's likely to be slightly less than that in single target in raids because a lot of your usefulness is use combustion at this specific time, and that's not as nerfed. In Mythic Plus, I don't know if the nerfs actually end up bigger than that because you work so hard to like pull around your mage a lot of the time, I think, in Mythic Plus, and like that's just not going to be a thing. Well, it's going to be a thing, but like that just gets hit the hardest out of everything, I think, with the Infernal Cascade and Flame Patch nerfs. But yeah, that's it for fire nerfs, I think. New legendaries, they're all dog shit. Necrolord one's okay on Cleave, but whatever, Necrolord sucks. Okay, so covenant changes. So every soulbind gets new traits and third potency. So not every spec gets the same benefit out of a third potency, and not every covenant gets the same benefit out of a third potency, because for a lot of specs, they only have 2 good potency conduits anyway. So they're kind of reliant on their covenant one being good. So the exception's Frost. Frost has like an okay third potency, but I'll get into that. So Night Fae, it's only really relevant for fire. They have a really good third potency conduit. Korean's new trait's kind of terrible, but Dreamweaver's traits are really good. So I think that considering that Wild Hunt Tactics is really bad in progress anyway, fire probably moves over to using Dreamweaver. I think like fire gains a lot from the third potency and the new soulbinds, but like I think this spec is just so bad number wise that it probably doesn't matter. Necrolord's Covenant was mainly used for Arcane. It was really good in progress because it gives you burst damage, with scales with targets, and it gives you Cleave. They're all things that like Arcane really wants, because it doesn't have Cleave built into its kit by default. So the problem with this is that Emny, which is the best soulbind for Arcane, like gains almost nothing in 9.1. The new trait's terrible, and Necrolord doesn't have a good third potency conduit, so Necrolord is pretty terrible in 9.1. So your choice really is going to be between Venthyr and Kyrian. So the new Venthyr traits are pretty good. The Theodore trait is kind of busted right now. I'm actually expecting it to get nerfed, but considering that we didn't have it in Sims until very, very recently, who knows if even Blizzard know it's good, to be honest. Venthyr has a pretty good third potency as well for all 3 specs. And then there's Kyrian. So Kyrian's kind of the hype at the moment. I think that it's a little bit overhyped, but I still think it's good. It's a pretty good multi-spec option because even though Venthyr is really good for Frost, it's kind of only mandatory on single target. Like, that's where you get the most benefit out of mirrors, and if you're playing Kyrian, you're never going to play Frost on pure single target anyway. And then the other plus to Kyrian is Kyrian, the new traits are absolutely busted, and they have a really good third potency conduit. So that's it for changes. I'm going to cover what the specs are good at, not in Sanctum of Domination, like just as like an abstract first, because I think that Fire has been the go-to spec for so long that the lines between Fire strength and Mage strength have kind of blurred a lot. So before I get into this, remember that damage profile matters a lot, like the most. Damage and damage profile are by far the most important things. Like, I know people will have like go on about mobility and defensives and all that shit, but like everyone keeps going on about how garbage Hunter defensives are, and they're right. And like Mage defensives are insanely good, but like every guild and every boss in Castle Nathria had 5 Hunters and 1 Mage, because like your damage is the most important thing. So I'll start off with the damage profile then. Fire's damage profile is actually more one-dimensional than people give it credit for. Fire is really good in BFA, and it's still good in Shadowlands, and I think that people assume because it's continued to be good that it's good for the same reasons, and it's not. Fire is still really good though, despite being kind of narrow, because the things that it does do come up a lot on Mythic Progress. So the 2 main things are Execute, which is also not correctly rated. So in Legion, the Fire Execute give you 350% extra damage, whereas now it only gives you 150% extra damage. It means it gives you mobility and not damage. It's a really interesting Execute because it means that the relative damage you do compared to other casters goes up the harder the phase is, or like the more movement the phase has. But it does mean that on fights where you don't move a lot, you don't really have Execute. And the other thing that I talked about earlier is that Combustion still has a really short cooldown. So this is useful, things like Gloom Veil. I don't know, if you were able to get your Combustion cooldown a little bit more in Castle Nathria, you would have had Combust for like every wave in Stone Legion, things like that. So if you need to do damage here, and like here is a really awkward time for a lot of classes, like Fire is still good at that. Those are the 2 main strengths of Fire. They, like, it doesn't actually do a huge amount past that, but like that's fine. Like that's like they're good things to do. But the issues with Fire are, if the execute phase isn't movement intensive, you probably just end up losing to the single target classes anyway. Like Sardonathrius, even though it was an execute boss or like a hard last phase, like you probably still just did less damage than an Affliction Warlock. Your cleave is really, really bad. So this is the biggest change from BFA. Obviously, Blaster Master was insane, the corruption was all insane. Ignite basically doesn't do anything anymore. On multi-target, you don't really spread Ignite. I think that Cleave with like a priority target is probably the most common type of multi-damage profile in raids. So being bad at Cleave is like not good. Another bad thing is, on a similar note, is that Fire has to choose between single target and AoE. You don't do the in-between very well. So essentially what happens is you're a single target class and you don't do top tier single targets. So if you don't abuse the Searing Touch mobility and you don't abuse weird combustion timings, like, what do you do? It's like not a lot. Okay, so Frost. What are the upsides to Frost? So it's got insanely good cleave. Its funnel is good. Its funnel is slightly overrated in the situation where the primary target is the only thing that matters. So if you think about something like Zul in Uldir, the boss was like the only thing that mattered, and you just like used all the ads to like funnel damage into the main target. But like Frost Mages in that boss just kind of did like slightly more boss damage. Like they weren't on the same tier as Rogues, but obviously Rogues were busted. But it's like your boss damage goes up a little bit, but it doesn't like go through the roof or anything. The big spot where Frost is good is whenever the secondary targets are relevant. They don't have to be as important as the main target, but if the damage you do to like other targets is even like remotely relevant, like Frost is insanely good. Where Frost is bad is it's 2021 and like flat damage profiles are like not good in Mythic Progression. Sometimes it doesn't matter. Flat damage is isn't always worse, but it's very rarely better. The biggest issue with Frost in Shadowlands is icy propulsion. It's like, it causes Frost to be a really, really big uptime spec. It was always an uptime spec because of Thermal Void and because it wasn't a burst spec, so it didn't want to see downtime and things like that, but icy propulsion like sends it through the roof. It basically, like, you double dip on downtime. It's kind of like a way to think about it. Like, you might stop attacking the boss for 10 seconds and you lose 10 seconds of icy veins, but really that 10 seconds of icy veins translates into like 40 seconds to a minute of icy veins lost. So flat damage specs are already worse in progress, but like that just makes it even worse. So what's Arcane at? Arcane has really similar strength to Fire, which is why it doesn't see a lot of play. So Arcane does good burst damage, it has the best single target, it has burst cleave, and it does big uncapped AoE. So those are pretty similar to Fire. The big upside that Arcane has is that it's not an uptime spec. It doesn't have kindling and it doesn't have icy propulsion. But it loses a couple of other things. It doesn't have the as good as execute. It kind of has execute if you're not playing Kyrian, but not really. And it doesn't have cheat death, but it does have other survivability things that make up for that. Its biggest weaknesses are sustained cleave and sustained AoE. So basically, like any kind of sustained multi-target, Arcane is quite bad at. Arcane and Frost cover each other's weaknesses pretty well, which is obviously good for us going into Sanctum of Domination because both of the specs are good. Okay, defensives and utility. I think it's quite similar in that people misattribute a lot of mage strengths to as fire strengths. So all three mage specs have really good mobility and really good defensives. Arcane has not been underplayed because of mobility. Fire still is the best mobility, but I think people underrate Arcane defensives. So Fire has cheat death. It's really good in progression, but I think it's disingenuous to just say Fire is cheat death and the other two specs don't, because all three specs get a spec-specific defensive. Arcane gets greater invis, which is the best shield wall in the game, I think. It's a 60% damage reduction on a 2-minute cooldown, and it's a feign death on steroids. Like, you can feign death things like Chain Slam and Sludge Fist, which is obviously like a huge deal. Or you could. I don't think you can now. But, you know, if that was to come up in like Brawl Force Progression or something, that's insane. Cold Snap gives you 2 blocks. It's pretty good. Like, if you had 2 blocks on those off, that would have been absolutely insane. Blizzard are really conscious of immunities now, and it doesn't really come up. So I do think that Cold Snap's the worst of the 3. I do think that Cauterize is the best of the 3, but there are certain fights or situations where greater invis could be good. And one last thing that I don't think people realize on defenses is all 3 barriers are actually different. Prismatic Barrier being the big one. Prismatic Barrier, while it's up, reduces your magic damage taken by 20%. And like, I don't know how people don't think that is like insanely busted. That is like a hunter shield wall on your 25-second cooldown absorb. It's the main reason why I think that Arcane is situationally better than Fire defensively in situations where cheat death is not good. So on the mobility front, Fire, not Execute Scorch, is a placebo in my opinion. Fire's the most mobile spec for 2 reasons. So you have unlimited mobility during Execute, which is obviously absolutely insane. Fights like Gahun, Avatar, KJ, and it protects its burst really well. So let's compare Fire and Arcane. Let's say you're on Sardonathrius, your Combustion or your Arcane Power, whatever it is, comes up, and the boss is about to cast Massacre. And then after Massacre, they suck you in with Hand of Destruction, you go through the mirror, and then they impale. Or the boss casts Impale. So if you're Arcane, you look and you see that Massacre's coming up, you can't Arcane Power because you'll have to move during Massacre. You can't AP right after it because the boss is going to pull you in, and then you go through the mirror. And then you have to make the decision, do I AP now? Do I wait for Impale? If you wait for Impale, you're delaying it even longer. If you just AP immediately, there's the risk that you might get Impale, and then you have to play Impale and lose rune up time or whatever. In that situation as Fire, you literally just slam Combust whenever, like, even if the Massacre's coming out, because you can sidestep, you can stay in rune, you only cast instants during Combustion. That is like the really busted reason why Fire will never not get its burst off, almost, which is like really busted for a burst spec. Frost the best spec for micro movement. It has a lot of instant casts. Downside is none of them are on demand, although you can like pull frozen orbs for things like Dark Recital or whatever. Arcane's probably the least mobile out of the 3, but like I said earlier, if you're not an uptime spec, you get like pseudo mobility. If you have to do a mechanic and everything's on cooldown, you generally don't care about it as much. The big thing is you don't protect your burst as well as Fire does. But like, this isn't an issue. I mean, like, Destruction Warlock has been a good spec. Like, Shadow Priest has been a good spec. Like, just because Fire is insane at these things doesn't mean that like other specs having to actually play the game properly is an issue. Okay, so what I think is going to be good in Sanctum of Domination. Okay, I think fire sucks. So if you look at rating in Castle Nathria, fire is good. But if you forget about what you saw in MDI, Great Push, Shadow Sea, whatever it was, if you just focus on rating, like fire was good, right? But it wasn't like S tier. Like a lot of guilds only had one mage in World First Race. Guilds below that maybe had 2, 3. I do think mage got better as the tier went on, but specs at that level, like you should be having discussions even if they should get nerfed in the first place. But like 10% nerf is just way too big. I think the combustion is still really good. Searing touch is still really good. If there's a fight that lets you abuse one of these things, fire can be good, but I don't think it exists in Sanctum. So people are obviously going to point out, oh well, like fire sucked in the first half of BFA, but you still played it on the end bosses. I think that's like an okay point, but there's two things about that. So Frost and Arcane were in much worse states back then than they were now. In the first half of BFA, like all three mage specs kind of sucked, and you just picked the spec that was the least deadweight, and that was fire, because like Gahun, Jaina, Unat, like the only phase that mattered was the last phase. And like the last phase is usually the most important, but like, you know, there was like DPS stops in early phases, and there was like the last phase was literally the only thing that mattered. And the second reason is I don't think KT or Sylvanas look like good searing touch bosses. So KT is like an Elisan style boss versus like 100 to 0 multiple times. And obviously if you've got an intense last phase and the boss only spends 30% of that in execute versus like 90 to 100% of it, the way it would be on a boss like Sardonathrius, that's an issue. It's the same with Sylvanas. Sylvanas is quite similar to N'Zoth in that the last phase is like an 80 to 0 last phase. So again, you only get like 50% uptime when you're executing as opposed to like 90 plus. So for those reasons, I think fire sucks. I think the other two specs are really good. So if you're playing Frost and you're looking at a boss, like what are you looking for? Like what do you want to see as like a boss? Like properties of a boss to make Frost good. So you want to see stack cleave, especially if there's a priority target. You want to see sustained funnel or sustained cleave. You want to see probably lots of target swapping, things like attendance on Council of Blood, you know, those like ads that don't live for very long, but you need to like kill them quickly. Like just swap, kill, you know, 3-4 globals, back to boss. Frost is quite good at that. If there are ads, you want them to be kind of like low priority ads that you can just like cleave. You don't want to like 5 ads to spawn and then them for to just instantly die, because you don't get the like funnel off that properly and you don't really burst them down. What you don't want to see if you're looking for Frost bosses is you don't want to see downtime and you don't want to see pure single target. While Frost single target is okay, it is like just okay, and I don't think it's like good enough if there's a raid where there's a lot of pure single target bosses. So I think Frost is the play on any boss with relevant multi-target. So right now that's Kel'Thuzad, I think is probably the big one. I think that Fate Scribe could be okay for Frost. It really depends how hard to kill the ads are and how relevant the ads are. It's really hard to judge how important ads are on raid testing, because our like ad health gets tuned so much. Like our gear is different whenever we get there, and like Stone Legion Generals, I think, is a good example. Like that was just a completely different boss in raid testing because the odds were just up all the time and people were like, oh my god, Frost is going to be so good here. But then like Game Alive, and it was a lot more about like focusing the main target but burst the odds down. So Arcane. Arcane gets ignored when Fire's good because, like I said, the two specs are pretty similar, but in 9.1 I don't think Fire's good. So what's Arcane looking for? You want to see lots of single target. You want to see stacked burst cleave, which also doubles up as burst funnel if you're playing Carrion and Rezo. You want to see downtime. You're not an uptime spec. A lot of specs now are uptime specs. Defensively, you want to see like predictable magic damage, which is the most common type of magic damage in raids, like your prismatic barrier is busted there. And if there's ads, you want to be able to line them up with your burst, and you don't want them to live for particularly long. You want to like do your Radiant Spark burst, and you want the ads to like die shortly after that. Because your two biggest weaknesses are sustained AoE and having to stand in melee for AoE. So I think that Arcane is probably the play on the harder fights. I think while Frost is good on like the easy bosses, like Eye of the Jailer, the 9, maybe Remnant, Soul Render. The only two hard bosses I think are Kel'Thuzad and maybe Fate Scribe, but I'm not convinced on either of those two yet. I think Arcane is the play on Guardian of the first ones and Sylvanas, which I'm predicting the last 4 bosses to be hard, because that's when like the Sludge Fist boss kind of starts. It would be similar to Castle Nathria in that way. With obviously Sylvanas being the big one. It could maybe be good on Painsmith, but I'm not sure. So if we're playing these two specs, what Covenant do we play? Kyrian and Venthyr are both fine for both specs. I think Kyrian gives you a stronger Arcane spec, obviously, and Venthyr gives you a stronger Frost spec. If you have a preference for any of those specs or any of those Covenants, just pick it and you'll be fine. I think Kyrian Arcane is very good, but I think it's a little bit overhyped. We're still in like the honeymoon period. Arcane hasn't been good in a while. It's finally good. I think people need to reel it in a little bit, but I think that Frost Venthyr is the most like well-rounded. I think that Venthyr and Frost are the most flexible across a bunch of different fight designs. I think Kyrian Arcane is a bit more dependent on like planning. It's going to be like a bit of a pain early on. It's like kind of a pain in Heroic Week or like the easy mythic bosses. But saying that, I think there's like a decent mix of single target cleave in the easy bosses. So, but my main worry for Frost is like there's downtime on Sylvanas, like potentially Fate Scribed. Like if you have to run off and do the rune mechanic and that's really slow, there's downtime on Paintsmith. On top of that, like it gets said a lot, and I don't know how people aren't shouting it from the rooftops. Burst damage is so much better on mythic progression than flat damage, like so much better. So for those reasons, like I think Kyrian Arcane is what I'm going to play. I think it's the best spec. So if you're curious what other people are doing, I think the Echo and Limit Mages are starting as Venthyr. Take from that what you will, because they started Castle Nathria as Venthyr as well, although they do have lots of characters, so you need to keep that in mind. Like I said, a lot of other guilds past that are starting as Kyrian. If you want to go, you can go look it up yourself. I'm not going to tell you what to do, I'm just telling you what various guilds are doing. Top guilds seem pretty... Well, the top end are playing Venthyr, the rest of it seems pretty split. So you look at all the information and you make the decision yourself. I'm not going to tell you what to play. I'm just telling you I'm playing Kyrian. So the reasons, assuming that both do similar damage, that they're tuned similarly, which I think they are, like Arcane is just burstier, Kyrian's burstier. That's just way better for progress. It's better defensively, like I said, Prismatic Barrier is completely busted. Does better single target, which I think is more relevant on the harder bosses. It deals with downtime way better. The main thing why I like Kyrian is because even if I need to play Frost, I won't be playing Frost in single target fights, and in that situation, like Mirrors of Torment is nowhere near as important as it is on single target. And on that note, like just fuck Mirrors of Torment in general. That spell is just awful. So those are my thoughts. You don't have to listen to me. I told you to play Venthyr and Castle Nathria, but then, you know. So what do I know? The most important thing I think is probably just to be flexible going into the new raid. You want to be free to swap to any Covenant, like at any time. If you see you made the wrong decision, like don't cling on to it. It's just whatever. Shit happens. Go next. Switch Covenant. There's always next tier. Even if we're pretty sure between Kyrian and Venthyr, you never know. Fire might get buffed or some stupid shit like that. But yeah, that's it for me. That's all my thoughts. I get that this was kind of rambly. It's my first video and I haven't really thought about this a huge amount. But anyway, if you like this, I guess, like, subscribe, all that stuff, whatever YouTubers say these days. I'm going to probably make boss guides and upload POVs to this channel whenever progress starts. I'm also going to be streaming. My stream name's exactly the same. I'll probably link it. But yeah, let me know what you think, and let me know if you want to see anything else like this. Thank you.